A grieving veteran was alone in his cabin when a faint cry rose from the snowy woods. He tried to tell himself it was only the wind, until the sound came again, weaker, closer, desperate. With the storm closing in, he followed the cries to an abandoned rest shelter deep among the pines. Behind the locked door, he found 5 German shepherds tied in the cold, too exhausted to escape. He cut them free one by one and rushed them through the storm to the only vet still open. But when he brought them home, the danger followed him back through the snow. That night, a hard knock struck his door, and a warning note told him he had saved what someone wanted gone. Winter came to Brightwater Notch, Vermont, with a kind of beauty that made strangers slow their cars and locals pretend not to notice. Snow gathered cleanly over the red barns along the lower road. The frozen lake held the pale morning light like a sheet of hammered glass. Pines climbed the hills in dark, patient rows, their branches carrying white weight without complaint, and by late afternoon the whole valley could look less like a place where people lived than a memory someone had preserved inside cold air. To Nolan Ashford, that beauty had become almost cruel. It made every empty space in his cabin sharper. It made the second mug on the shelf look more deliberate. It made the chair beside the wood stove seem less like furniture and more like evidence. Nolan was 57, tall and broad-shouldered in the way of a man whose strength had settled deep instead of showing off. His dark hair had gone silver at the temples and grew longer than it had in his service years, pushed back with his fingers and never quite behaving. A short salt and pepper beard framed a face that looked as if it had learned to hold pain without asking anyone what to do with it. His nose bent slightly where it had once been broken, and a thin scar cut through the edge of his left brow. But it was his eyes people noticed first when he still came into town often enough to be noticed, green-gray, steady, tired, and always seeming to listen beyond the conversation. 3 years earlier, his wife, Clara, had died of a heart condition that had moved quietly until it did not. Since then, Nolan had stayed at the edge of the woods above Brightwater Notch, in the cabin they had built together when they still believed old age would be something they reached side by side. He did not think of himself as lonely. Loneliness sounded too soft, too willing to be pitied. Nolan thought of his life as orderly. Firewood stacked by length under the lean-to, fuel cans marked and rotated, rifle cleaned though rarely touched, radio batteries tested on Sundays, snow shovel kept inside the mudroom, not outside where a drift could bury it. He ate at the same hour, slept badly at the same hour, and spoke to the empty rooms only when something went wrong with a hinge, a pipe, or his own balance. Clara would have hated the silence. She had believed a house should make room for interruptions, neighbors, lost hikers, stray dogs, somebody's broken truck, somebody's bad news. Nolan had loved that about her when she was alive. After she was gone, he avoided everything that carried her shape. That was why he had not gone up to the old Brightwater rest station in more than 3 years. The rest station sat above the second ridge, halfway along an old trail used by hunters, snowshoe hikers, and stubborn locals who trusted their own memory more than marked roads. Once it had been a simple but useful place: 4 timber walls, a stove, emergency blankets, a hand-crank radio, canned food, a map sealed under scratched plastic. Clara had fought to keep it stocked after a storm, nearly took 2 grown men who had misread the weather, and spent a night in a drainage hollow with wet boots. She had organized coffee drives, church basement auctions, donation jars at the feed store. People don't die in winter because the cold is evil, she had told Nolan once, standing at their kitchen table with a list of supplies spread beneath her hands. They die because everyone assumes someone else will check. Nolan could still hear her say it, which was exactly why he did not go there anymore. The sound began in late November. At first, it came only on nights when the wind changed direction and slid down from Brightwater Hill through the pines behind the cabin. Nolan would be carrying ash from the stove or locking the shed when he heard something thin and strained riding inside the gusts. Not a wolf, not coyotes, not the high bark of foxes. It had a pulled-apart quality to it, as though the sound had struck rocks and timber before reaching him. A cry, maybe, a whine, then nothing. He told himself the woods made liars of sound in winter. He had known trees to groan like doors and ice to crack like gunfire. He had heard wind move through old cabins and imitate voices closely enough to turn a man's head, so he ignored it, but it returned. Some nights it came once, some nights twice, always from the higher slope, always broken by distance. There were evenings when he stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, the cold slipping around his boots, and waited for it to come again so he could prove to himself it was just weather. When it did not, he felt foolish. When it did, he felt worse. The sound did not feel like a thing asking to be understood. It felt like a thing trying not to disappear. By the first week of December, Brightwater was talking about a major storm rolling down from the north, the kind that made sensible people over-prepare and foolish people dangerous. Nolan spent the morning doing what he knew how to do. He split kindling, he checked the generator, he filled the bathtub halfway in case the pump failed. He brought in 2 extra armloads of wood and lined the lanterns on the kitchen counter. His hands moved with old discipline, but his thoughts kept drifting uphill. Around noon, when sunlight lay bright and cold across the snowfield beyond his cabin, the sound came again. This time it was not one cry. Nolan stopped with a fuel can in his hand. The wind had dropped for a moment, leaving the world unnervingly clear. From beyond the dark pines came a faint, ragged chorus. Several voices, maybe, tangled together and then cut short. It was low, exhausted, almost swallowed before it reached the yard. But Nolan heard enough. His grip tightened on the fuel can until the metal handle bit through his glove. "No," he said to the empty yard. Though he did not know whether he was speaking to the sound, to the mountain, or to the part of himself that already knew he would have to go. He stood there longer than he should have. A man could talk himself out of almost anything if he chose the right words. The storm was coming. The trail would be bad. The sound might be old, carried strangely by air. He was not sheriff, not rescue crew, not the man Clarissa used to send up the road with extra blankets because someone needed him. He was just a widower with a bad knee in cold weather and enough ghosts already stored in his house. Then the cry came once more, thinner than before, and something inside him shifted, not dramatically, not bravely, but with the heavy click of a lock giving way. Nolan looked toward the ridge where the rest station waited behind the pines. He thought of Clara's hands flattening that supply list on the kitchen table. He thought of her saying, "They die because everyone assumes someone else will check." And for the first time in years, the memory did not feel like a wound asking to be avoided. It felt like an instruction. Nolan moved quickly after that, because hesitation had become unbearable. He loaded thick blankets into the bed of his old pickup, then added a coil of rope, a bolt cutter, a hunting knife, a flashlight, a first aid kit, 2 towels, and the emergency radio Clara had labeled in black marker. From the peg beside the mudroom door, he took her moss-green knit cap, the one she had made him during their first winter in the cabin. He had not worn it in over a year. He stood with it in his hands for a moment before pulling it down over his hair. The wool had stretched at the edges. A faint thread had come loose near the seam. It felt foolishly warm. The truck fought the hill road from the start. Snow had already begun to skim across the tracks, and the higher Nolan drove, the more the light changed from bright winter gold to something flat and white. Pines pressed closer to the narrow road. The world beyond the windshield narrowed to trunks, drifts, and the weak swing of his headlights under a sky that seemed to be lowering by the minute. He parked where the old vehicle path ended, shouldered the pack, took the bolt cutter, and continued on foot. The trail to the rest station had never been long in good weather. In rising snow, it felt like a place moving away from him. Twice Nolan stopped to listen. Twice he heard nothing but wind. The third time, just as he reached the line of spruce trees above the station clearing, a muffled whine slipped through the timber. Close now, real now, not memory, not weather. The rest station stood in the clearing below him, its roof bowed under snow, its windows dark, its old chimney crooked against the white sky. From a distance it looked abandoned in the ordinary way. Forgotten, weathered, harmless. But when Nolan came closer, the wrongness showed itself. The door had been pulled tight with a new steel hasp. A fresh padlock hung where there had once been a simple latch. Snow had drifted across the threshold, but not enough to hide the churned marks beneath it. Sled runners, boot prints, something dragged. Nolan set down his pack. For several seconds he only looked at the lock. The new metal shone faintly in the stormlight, and anger rose in him with such sudden force that it almost steadied him. Someone had come here recently. Someone had sealed a public shelter before a major storm. Someone had taken a place Clara once fought to keep open and turned it into a closed mouth. The first hit from the bolt cutter did not break the lock. The second twisted it. The third snapped it loose with a sound that seemed too loud in the clearing. From inside the station came a rustle, then a low, terrified sound that made Nolan's chest tighten before his mind could name it. He pushed the door open. The smell struck first: cold wood, old ash, urine, fear, wet fur, and the metallic tang of equipment left in freezing air. The beam of his flashlight swung across the room, found the stove, the broken supply shelf, the overturned bench, and then stopped. 5 German shepherds hung between the support posts, not by their necks, not fully off the ground. Heavy industrial rescue straps had been looped and tightened around their chests, shoulders, and bellies, suspending them cruelly so their paws brushed the floor without finding purchase. They were alive, but only barely holding themselves inside their bodies. One large male sagged with his head low. A smaller female trembled so violently the strap creaked against the post. Another had twisted enough to press one paw against the boards, though it gave him no relief. Their coats were black and tan, dulled by dirt and melted snow, their breath coming in shallow bursts that fogged and vanished. Nolan did not move for a heartbeat. Some part of him refused the sight, not because he had never seen suffering. He had. But this was not chaos, this was design. Whoever had done this understood straps, weight, restraint, and panic. Whoever had done this knew how to make the body fight itself. Then one of the dogs raised her head. She was a black and tan female, lean beneath the dirt, with a dark saddle across her back and warm honey color along her chest and legs. Her muzzle was black, her right ear torn slightly at the edge, and a small pale gold mark showed at the front of her chest like a buried ember. Around her neck hung a ripped strip of orange fabric, part of some old rescue vest, the faded letters too damaged to read. Her amber eyes fixed on Nolan, not with trust and not with threat, but with a terrible, exhausted attention. Even then, even strapped and shaking, she turned her head toward the others as if counting them. Nolan's breath left him unevenly. "All right," he said, voice rough, though none of the dogs could know yet what kind of man he was. "I've got you. I've got you." He cut the first strap too quickly and had to catch the dog before the animal collapsed hard onto the floor. After that, he forced himself to slow down. Strap, hand under chest, ease the weight, lower, blanket. He spoke the whole time, because silence felt too much like what had been done to them. The large male came down with a groan. The small female folded into herself and tried to disappear beneath the bench. One young dog shook so hard his teeth clicked. The female with the torn ear was last, because she kept straining weakly toward the others whenever Nolan approached, as if fear mattered less than making sure no one was left hanging. When he finally cut her free, she did not bite, she did not run. She simply fell against, all bone, trembling muscle, and cold fur. Nolan held her for one stunned second, feeling the frantic beat of her heart through his gloves, and something in him broke open with a quietness that hurt more than noise. He had spent 3 years telling himself that the world beyond his door could manage without him. Yet here were 5 living creatures in a shelter Clara had once fought to keep open, and every one of them had been waiting in the cold while he measured his reasons not to go. He carried them out one by one. The storm thickened while he worked. Snow blew sideways across the clearing, filling his footprints almost as soon as he made them. He lined the truck bed with blankets, laid the dogs close enough for warmth but not so close their injuries touched, and covered them with the heavy canvas tarp. The female with the torn ear was the last to go in. As Nolan lifted her, the orange strip at her neck shifted, and he saw one clear piece of faded lettering, Brightwater, a name, not a number. That detail nearly undid him. He slid her gently beside the others. "Brightwater," he said, testing the name aloud. Her eyes opened halfway. She did not lift her head, but her gaze moved once toward the 4 shapes under the blankets, as if even now she needed proof they had not vanished. Nolan secured the tarp and turned back toward the station to grab his pack. That was when he saw the figure. At the far edge of the pines, beyond the clearing, Someone stood in the falling snow. The person was too distant to identify, too still to be a passerby, too deliberately placed to be accidental. No wave, no shout, no attempt to help, just a dark shape between the trunks, watching the truck, the broken lock, the open door, and Nolan standing with the bolt cutter in his hand. For a long second, neither moved. The wind lifted snow between them like torn cloth. Nolan took one step forward. The figure stepped back into the trees and disappeared. For a moment, Nolan heard only the storm and the faint, living breaths under the tarp behind him. Then he understood with a cold certainty that did not need evidence yet. Whoever had done this was not gone from Brightwater Hill. Whoever had done this had seen him take the dogs. And the thing Nolan had walked into was not over, because 5 lives had been carried out of a ruined shelter. It had only just noticed him. Nolan drove down from Brightwater Hill with both hands locked around the steering wheel and the old pickup shuddering beneath him like something alive and afraid. The storm had strengthened while he was inside the rest station. Snow now came sideways across the road, slicing through the headlights in hard white streams, and the downhill grade had begun to glaze over with ice. The truck bed behind him held 5 German shepherds under a canvas tarp and every blanket he had been able to spare, including 2 faded wool ones Clara used to keep folded in the mudroom for somebody who might need them before we do. That had been her way. She prepared for strangers with the same seriousness other people reserved for family. Nolan had not touched those blankets in 3 years. Now, at every curve, he found himself glancing into the rearview mirror, not because he could see through the tarp, but because looking away felt like abandonment. He drove slower than the fear in him wanted. Twice the rear wheels slid toward the ditch, and twice he corrected before the truck lost the road. The first dog, the large, older male, had barely moved since Nolan carried him out. The small female had tried to crawl under the others, even in the truck bed, trembling in a way that made the blankets twitch. The young dark-coated male had snapped once at empty air. Not at Nolan, not at anything visible, just at the memory of restraint. But Briar was the one Nolan kept thinking of. The black and tan female with the torn right ear had lifted her head 3 times as he secured the tarp, each movement weak and deliberate, each time turning not toward freedom, but toward the other 4 bodies beside her. Nolan had seen soldiers do that in field hospitals, men barely conscious asking with their eyes whether the person next to them had made it. He had not expected to see it in a dog. He had not expected it to hurt the same. Brightwater's main street was nearly empty by the time he reached town. Shop windows glowed dimly behind storm shutters. A plow had passed once but was already losing the fight. The veterinary clinic sat between a hardware store and a dark diner, its porch light throwing a small amber circle onto the snow. Nolan had called from the truck as soon as the signal returned, and Dr. Grace Bellamy was waiting with the back door open before he pulled into the alley. She stood in the light wearing a cream-colored veterinary coat over a charcoal turtleneck, her chestnut hair threaded with silver and pinned low at the back of her head. Grace was 52, lean, steady, with eyes that missed very little and a face that had learned not to waste panic. In Brightwater, people trusted her because she did not dramatize bad news. She simply made room for it, washed her hands, and went to work. "Nolan," she said when she saw the tarp move. "Not a question, not yet." "There are 5, he answered, his voice rough from cold and the strain of holding himself together. "All alive, barely." Grace's expression changed only in the tightening around her mouth. "Inside, one at a time. Don't rush their legs. They may not be able to feel where the floor is." That was Grace. The horror could wait, but circulation could not. Together they carried the dogs through the rear entrance into the treatment room, where heat, antiseptic, and white light struck Nolan almost as hard as the smell inside the rest station had. The room was small and clean, crowded now by folded towels, warming pads, IV stands, stainless tables, and the emergency crates Grace had pulled from storage. She did not ask Nolan to explain everything at once. She put him where he could be useful. "Hold here. Lift under the ribs, not the belly. Keep the head low. Don't touch that shoulder yet. Talk before you move. Let them hear you coming." The older male came first. Grace found a cracked leather tag half hidden under his thick neck fur. "Cobalt," she murmured. writing it on a strip of tape and placing it on the blanket beneath him. The smallest female had a torn green collar with a brass tag scratched almost smooth, Juniper. The young male with the darker coat had no readable tag, but a faint stencil on the broken strap near his chest read Flint in black marker. The softer-eyed female, golden through the legs even under dirt and meltwater, carried the name Meadow on a worn clinic band from somewhere else. Briar's name came last, from the orange strip still caught at her neck, letters faded but stubborn. 5 names, not strays in the abstract, not a problem to be moved, 5 living beings with a before. Grace worked with the kind of silence that made every small sound important. A thermometer, beep, tape tearing, a dog's breath hitching, Nolan's boots shifting when he realized he was standing too stiffly. She checked gums, pulses, pupils, pads. She cut away straps without tugging skin. She ran her fingers lightly along the marks pressed into their chests and shoulders. The injuries were not all fresh. That was the first thing she did not say aloud. Nolan saw it anyway in the way her jaw set. Old pressure lines under new bruising, places where fur had grown back unevenly, small scabbed cuts beneath raw strap burns. Whoever had tied them had not been improvising in a rage. This was control, repetition, practice. These straps, Nolan said, because if he did not speak, he might hear again the sound of the lock snapping on the rest station door. They were rescue straps, industrial kind, not rope. Grace nodded without looking up. Yes, someone knew what they were doing. This time she did look at him. Someone knew enough to make it last. The words went into the room and stayed there. Outside, wind hit the clinic wall so hard the old glass in the cabinets trembled. On the table nearest the heater, Briar tried to lift her head. Grace had just started a warmed fluid line, and Nolan reached instinctively to stop her from moving, then remembered Grace's warning and spoke first. "Easy, girl. Easy." Briar did not look at him. Her amber eyes searched the room until they found Cobalt on the floor blanket, then Juniper, then Flint, then Meadow. Only after she had seen each one did her head drop again. Grace's hand paused above the bandage roll. For the first time since Nolan arrived, something like grief crossed her face. "She's counting them," Grace said quietly. Nolan swallowed, and the small treatment room seemed suddenly too bright, too warm, too full of proof that pain had not managed to erase loyalty. He turned away for a second under the pretense of wiping snowmelt from his beard. On the wall near the medicine cabinet hung a bulletin board with community notices, vaccination reminders, missing cat flyers, a faded photo of Grace standing beside a sled dog with a bandaged paw, and one old flyer Nolan had avoided looking at for years. Brightwater Winter Safety Fundraiser, with Clara's handwriting across the bottom announcing donated soup, coffee, blankets, and trail maps. He had not known Grace kept it, or maybe he had known and simply never come in long enough to see. Clara smiled in the photo beside the flyer, not posed, caught mid-law with a stack of folded blankets in her arms. Nolan felt the room tilt around that smile. He looked back at Briar because an injured dog was easier to face than a woman he had lost. Grace followed his glance to the flyer but did not comment. She was kind enough not to use grief as a tool. Instead, she taped another line, checked Meadow's temperature, and said, "Tell me exactly where you found them." Nolan told her in pieces while they worked. Brightwater Rest Station, new lock, drag marks, industrial straps. The figure at the edge of the pines. He expected Grace to interrupt when he mentioned the person watching from the trees, but she only reached for her phone with her clean hand and called Sheriff Tessa Holcomb. "Back entrance," she said into the phone. "No siren if you can help it. 5 dogs, severe restraint injuries, possible active threat. And Tessa, keep this quiet for now." When she hung up, Nolan understood the last sentence before she explained it. Brightwater was a small town with long winters. News did not spread there. It hardened, gathered weight, and started rolling downhill. Grace washed her hands again, slower this time, then leaned against the counter for half a breath. "This isn't the first," she said. Nolan looked at her. "In the last 6 weeks, I've had 3 large dogs brought in from the North Roads. 2 were already gone. 1 survived, but not well. Before that, people reported missing working dogs. Hunting dogs, farm dogs, dogs trained for trail work. The owners thought maybe theft, maybe coyotes, maybe somebody passing through." Grace's voice stayed level, but it cost her something. The living ones were afraid of the same things: hard knocks on wood, snowmobile horns, straps, cold oil, pine resin. Why didn't anyone say this was connected? Because people like separate tragedies better than patterns, Grace said. Patterns ask them to do something. The sheriff arrived 10 minutes later through the back door, shaking snow from a dark winter coat marked only by a small county patch and a scratched silver badge. Tessa Holcomb was 44, compact and sturdy, with dark hair tied at the nape of her neck and a face that looked built for weather and bad meetings. She took in the room quickly: the dogs, the blankets, Nolan's wet coat, Grace's blood-specked gloves, the storm pressing at the windows. She did not waste time asking whether this was serious. "Who else knows?" she asked. "Just us," Grace said, "and whoever stood in the trees watching Nolan load them." Tessa's eyes moved to Nolan. He told it again, shorter this time. Tessa listened without writing until he finished, then pulled out a waterproof notebook and wrote only the useful things: location, time, lock, straps, figure, vehicle tracks, if any, weather conditions. When Nolan mentioned the new hasp on the rest station door, her mouth tightened. "That shelter is town property." Nolan said before he could stop himself. Town stopped acting like it mattered. Tessa did not argue. Maybe because she remembered Clara too. Everyone in Brightwater did, though most had learned not to say her name around Nolan. "I'll call Caleb Morrow as soon as the line holds. Fish and Wildlife has better field evidence kits than we do, and if animals are being taken through the forest routes, this is bigger than a local cruelty complaint." Grace wrapped a bandage around Flint's foreleg. "Tessa, people are going to blame Dale." The name landed with a heaviness Nolan recognized even before he remembered the man. Dale Rusk, recently released, lived near the old quarry road. Years ago he had robbed a fuel shed during a bad stretch, run from deputies, and been brought down by a police dog before he made it across the highway. People in Brightwater had a way of turning a man's worst day into his permanent name. Dale was not Dale anymore. He was the one the dog took down. Tessa capped her pen. "They already are. 2 missing dog calls this week mentioned him without evidence." Grace's voice sharpened just slightly. "Rumor isn't evidence." "No," Tessa said, "but frightened people use it like a weapon." Nolan looked down at Briar. The dog had slipped into a shallow, uneasy half-sleep, but her paws still twitched each time the storm knocked against the rear door. He imagined the town hearing what he had found, imagined trucks turning toward Dale's place, men carrying old anger under the clean name of justice. He had seen mobs before, though they wore different uniforms in different places. "If Dale didn't do this," Nolan said, "and people go after him, then we'll have 2 crimes instead of 1, Tessa finished. The lights flickered, once, twice. Then the clinic went dark except for the emergency lamp above the surgery door. A low alarm chirped from the medicine refrigerator. Grace moved immediately to the generator switch near the hall, but when she turned it, the engine outside coughed, caught, sputtered, and died. She tried again. Nothing. The heat blower fell silent. In that silence, the room seemed to shrink around the 5 injured dogs. "How long?" Tessa asked. Grace was already checking the backup battery display. "Not long enough. The warming pads will drain fast. If the heat drops, Cobalt and Briar are in trouble first. Meadow, too." Nolan knew what Grace was not saying. The clinic had skill, medicine, light for a while, but not shelter enough for this storm if the generator failed. His own place did. The woodshop beside his cabin had a cast iron stove, an independent generator, thick walls, space to separate the dogs, and no neighbors close enough to gossip through a window. It was not ideal. It was simply the best bad option. "My shop," he said. Grace looked at him, and for a moment he saw the objection forming. They were too fragile to move again. The roads were worse now. He lived alone. Whoever had watched him might know where he lived. Tessa saw it too. "You sure?" the sheriff asked. Nolan almost said no. Honesty pushed up hard in him. No, he was not sure. He was a man who had spent 3 years arranging his life, so nothing helpless would depend on him. He was not sure he could keep 5 broken dogs alive through a storm. He was not sure he could stand the sounds they would make in the night. He was not sure what would happen if the person from the trees followed. But then Briar opened her eyes, not fully, just enough to find him. Nolan did not know whether she saw safety, danger, or simply another human shape in a room full of pain. But she looked at him, and he understood that certainty was a luxury the helpless rarely got to wait for. "My shop," he repeated. "Wood stove, generator, radio. Enough room. I can keep them warm." Grace studied him for another second, then nodded once. "Then we do it carefully. No sudden lifting, no crowding them. I'll send meds, fluids, instructions, and you call me every 2 hours on the radio whether anything changes or not." Tessa turned toward the door. "I'll clear the alley and follow you as far as the lower road. After that, I'll keep patrol near town and make the call to Caleb. Nobody hears about Dale. Nobody hears about the dogs until morning." Grace began packing supplies with calm urgency: syringes, bandages, thermometers, saline bags wrapped in towels, pain medication labeled by name, instructions written in block letters, because she knew exhaustion made fools of careful men. Nolan carried Cobalt first, then Juniper, then Flint, then Meadow, each dog wrapped and lifted as if the wrong pressure might break whatever thin thread still held them to the world. Briar came last. When Nolan slid his arms beneath her, she stiffened, then shuddered, then let her head rest for one brief second against his coat. It was not trust, not yet, but it was not refusal either. Outside, the storm swallowed the alley, the clinic light blurring behind them as they loaded the truck. Tessa stood beside the open door, one hand braced against the wind, watching the road as if she expected the darkness itself to move. Grace tucked the last blanket around Briar and pressed the radio into Nolan's gloved hand. 2 hours, she said. "And Nolan," he looked at her, "don't turn your shop into a battlefield. Turn it into a place where nothing has to be afraid of your hands." Nolan closed his fingers around the radio. The words struck deeper than instruction. They sounded almost like something Clara would have said, though Clara would have found a gentler way to say it. He climbed into the truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the clinic with 5 wounded dogs behind him, a sheriff's headlights following through the snow, and a responsibility he had not asked for settling into the empty places of his life with the weight of something alive. By the time Nolan brought the 5 German shepherds back to his property, the storm had turned the road behind him into something that looked less traveled than erased. Sheriff Tessa Holcomb followed him as far as the lower bend, her headlights a steady pair of pale eyes in the blowing snow, then flashed once before turning back toward town. From there, Nolan climbed alone, slow and careful, the truck grinding up the narrow track toward the cabin and the wood shop that stood 20 yards behind it. The shop had once been a place of noise and usefulness. Before Clara died, Nolan had built shelves there, repaired neighbors' broken chairs, sharpened axes, cut boards for the rest station, and complained without conviction whenever Clara added another project to the pegboard. After she was gone, he used it mostly for storage and firewood. Tonight, with the stovepipe already breathing smoke into the storm and the old generator thumping beside the back wall, it became something else entirely. Not a hospital, not a shelter with a name, just a warm room that had not yet failed anyone. Nolan unloaded the dogs one by one, moving with the careful slowness Grace had drilled into him at the clinic. Cobalt came first, heavy and nearly limp, his graying muzzle tucked against Nolan's sleeve as though exhaustion had made even fear too expensive. Juniper trembled so hard that the blanket around her seemed alive, and when Nolan set her down near the stove, she immediately pressed her face into the fold of wool, hiding from the light more than from him. Flint reacted to the metal latch on the shop door with a hoarse, strangled sound that made Nolan freeze until the dog settled again. Meadow's eyes followed every movement of the lantern beam, wide and wet, her body flinching before his hands came close. Briar came last. She was lighter than Nolan expected, all heat loss and stubborn breath beneath the blanket, but when he carried her inside, she lifted her head just enough to locate the others. Nolan placed her in the middle because she seemed unable to rest unless she could see them all. He did not know whether that was training, instinct, or the remnant of terror, but he honored it because there was so little else he could give. The shop smelled of cedar shavings, iron, stove smoke, damp wool, and medicine. Nolan had cleared a half circle around the cast iron stove, laid down tarps, then blankets, then the thick quilts from the storage trunk Clara had packed years ago for emergencies nobody puts on calendars. He kept each dog far enough apart that a bad dream would not become a collision. but close enough that they could hear one another breathing. Grace's written instructions lay on the workbench under a wrench, so the draft from the door would not lift them. Check temperature. Offer warm water in small amounts. Do not force food. Speak before touching. Watch for pale gums, shaking that worsens, breathing that changes, swelling, bleeding through bandages. Radio every 2 hours. Nolan followed every line as if failing to obey the shape of a letter might cost a life. He heated water on the stove, cooled it with snowmelt in a tin bowl, tested it against his wrist, and moved from dog to dog with a mechanic's precision softened by something he did not want to name. In the army, usefulness had often meant force, speed, command, getting men out or getting them down. Here, usefulness meant lowering his voice. It meant waiting until Juniper stopped shrinking before he set the bowl near her. It meant letting Flint smell the thermometer before using it. It meant placing his hand flat on the floor beside Briar instead of on her body, allowing her to decide whether the distance could close. Around 10, the radio crackled, and Grace's voice pushed through static. Ashford. Status. Nolan read the numbers from his notebook. Grace asked about gum color, tremors, fluid intake, Briar's alertness, Cobalt's breathing. Her voice was tired but steady, and the steadiness traveled through the storm better than comfort would have. "You're doing fine," she said at the end. "Remember, no sudden affection. Injured animals don't need to be convinced you're kind. They need to survive enough hours to discover it." Nolan looked across the shop at Briar. Her amber eyes were half open, watching him from above the blanket's edge. "That true for people too?" he asked before he could stop himself. Static filled the line for a breath. Grace did not answer too quickly. "Often," she said, "but people make it harder by pretending they don't need the same things." The radio clicked quiet. Nolan stood with it in his hand, feeling the shop settle around him. Outside, the storm dragged branches across the roof. Inside, 5 injured dogs breathed in uneven rhythms, and for the first time in 3 years, the room demanded something from him other than maintenance. He found Clara's old emergency binder in a drawer while looking for spare tape. It was exactly where she would have left it, labeled in her square handwriting, full of lists for storms, phone trees, trail maps, notes about elderly residents who needed check-ins, and a page titled Animal Straws, Lost Dogs, in blue ink. Nolan almost shut the binder at once. Instead, he kept it open. Beside a list of donated blankets, Clara had written a sentence he remembered hearing but had forgotten seeing. "Quiet hands first. Warmth before trust." He read it twice. Then he tore a strip of tape, wrote each dog's name in block letters, and fixed the labels to the blankets so he would not confuse the medication schedule when exhaustion came for him. Cobalt, Juniper, Flint, Meadow, Briar. 5 names in Clara's kind of order. Briar watched the tape move, her torn ear twitching faintly. When Nolan set the marker down, she shifted, not toward him but toward the space between the stove and the door. It was barely a movement, yet it changed the room. Even weakened, she had placed herself where anything entering would have to pass her before reaching the others. Nolan lowered himself onto the stool by the workbench and suddenly understood that courage did not always arrive standing tall. Sometimes it lay on a quilt, fevered and shaking, still trying to be a wall. Near midnight, the storm hit harder. Wind slammed snow against the south wall in heavy bursts, and the shop roof groaned under shifting weight. Nolan had just finished checking Meadow's temperature when the first knock came. It was not the random slap of a branch or the loose rattle of old siding. It was wood answering knuckles. One heavy strike, a pause, another, a third, slow enough to be understood, hard enough to be meant. Every dog changed before Nolan fully stood. Cobalt pressed himself flat to the blanket, muscles locking beneath his bandages. Juniper shoved backward under the lower shelf, dragging the edge of her quilt with her. Flint made a trapped sound and turned his head away from the door as though the noise itself had a shape. Meadow's whole body began to tremble, not with cold now, but with recognition. Briar tried to rise. Her front legs buckled. She tried again. Nolan reached out, then stopped before touching her, remembering Grace's warning, and instead spoke low. "Briar." She did not stay. She got one paw under herself, then another, and with a pain that showed in every inch of her body, she placed herself between the door and the other dogs. Nolan felt something hot and helpless move through his chest. All right, he whispered. Then I'm going with you. He took the flashlight from the bench and the old hunting shotgun from the rack above the cabinet. The weapon felt heavier than it should have. Perhaps because the last time he had held it with purpose, Clara had still been alive to tell him not to let fear make his decisions for him. He moved toward the door without turning on the overhead light. The knocks did not come again. The silence after them was worse. Nolan lifted the latch and opened the door fast, flashlight raised into the storm. Snow blew into the shop in a white sheet. The porch was empty. Beyond it, the yard vanished in darkness and moving snow. No footprints held long enough to read. No figure stood beneath the trees. No engine sound carried over the wind. For a moment, Nolan saw nothing but the beam catching flakes. Then the light dropped to the doorframe. A small knife had been driven into the wood just below the latch. Beneath it, folded once and already wet at the edges, was a piece of paper. Nolan pulled the knife free with his gloved hand, took the paper inside, and shut the door against the storm. The dogs did not relax. Briar's eyes fixed on the note as if paper could have a scent. Nolan unfolded it under the lantern. The handwriting was blocky, hard-pressed, written with a marker that had bled slightly where snow touched it. Old man, you dragged trouble home. Next time, I won't leave them breathing. The words did not frighten him first. They angered him. Then, when the anger cleared enough to let thought in, they did something colder. Whoever had written this knew where he lived, knew he had brought the dogs here, knew he was alone. Nolan placed the note on the bench, then noticed Briar's reaction had worsened. Her body had gone rigid, her nose lifted slightly toward the air seeping around the door. Cobalt whined deep in his chest. Flint tucked his head, shaking harder. Nolan smelled it then too, faint but distinct beneath snow and wood smoke. Cold machine oil. Wet pine resin, damp metal, and a harsh synthetic odor like rescue webbing soaked in sweat and weather. It clung to the knife handle, to the note, maybe to the glove of whoever had placed it there. Briar was not solving a mystery. She was remembering with her body. The realization took the anger out of Nolan and replaced it with something more dangerous because it was quieter. These dogs had not simply been hurt. They had been taught that certain sounds meant pain was coming, certain smells meant helplessness, certain human rituals, the knock, the waiting, the object left behind, could turn a warm room back into the place they had just escaped. Nolan set the shotgun down on the bench, far from the dogs, and crouched slowly beside Briar. He doesn't get to bring that room in here, he said. His voice shook once, then steadied, not tonight. Briar trembled for a long time before her legs gave out and she sank back onto the quilt. Nolan did not sleep after that. He radioed Grace, then Tessa. Grace told him to lower the light and keep the room predictable. Tessa told him to touch nothing else and stay armed but inside. Nolan spent the remaining hours feeding the stove, writing down every detail he could remember, and sitting where Briar could see him without having to lift her head. By dawn, the storm had weakened into a pale, blowing haze. Snow buried the porch steps and rounded the edges of every object in the yard. Tessa arrived first in a county SUV fitted with chains, her face grim beneath a black knit cap. Caleb Morrow arrived behind her in a green-gray fish and wildlife truck, moving with the measured patience of a man who trusted evidence more than urgency. He was about 50, lean from fieldwork, with a short yellow-gray beard, weather-reddened skin, and a small camera hanging from a strap across his chest. He greeted Nolan with a nod rather than sympathy, which Nolan appreciated more than he expected. "Show me without touching," Caleb said. He photographed the door, the knife, the note, the porch rail, the drift patterns, the latch, the hinge. The storm had erased its most tracks, but not everything. In the seam of the door near the latch, Caleb found a smear of black oil mixed with something amber and sticky. He lifted a sample with a swab and smelled it once. "Machine oil," he said. "Cold weather grade, pine resin too. Maybe from a sled runner brushing fresh-cut branches, maybe from storage near cut timber." From the knife handle he teased loose a tiny synthetic fiber, dark blue and stiff. Webbing or technical outerwear, could be rescue gear, could be snowmobile equipment, could be tow harness material. Not enough to accuse anybody. Enough to say this wasn't left by someone walking over from town in wool mittens. Tessa had been quiet, reading the note without touching the ink. Her face held the flat calm Nolan was beginning to recognize as anger under discipline. "There's another problem," she said. A deputy found a strip of similar webbing near Dale Rusk's place before sunrise. Too visible. Right beside his woodpile, where anyone driving by would notice if they were looking. Nolan looked from Tessa to the dogs, then back to the note on his bench. "That's convenient." "Very," Tessa said. Caleb sealed the fiber in a small evidence envelope. "Convenient evidence is still evidence," he said, "but it's usually evidence of what somebody wants us to think." Nolan turned toward Briar. She was awake, eyes dull with exhaustion but fixed on the door. The shop was warm, the dogs were alive, yet the night had changed something. The danger was no longer hidden up at the abandoned rest station, waiting in the woods for someone curious enough to find it. It had crossed the ridge, come down through the storm, and knocked on Nolan Ashford's door. And as he looked at the planted clue meant to point toward Dale Rusk, Nolan understood the first real shape of the thing in front of him. Whoever was doing this did not only know how to hurt dogs, he knew how to make people hurt the wrong man. Morning came too bright for what had happened in the night. The storm had moved east before dawn, leaving Brightwater notch under a hard blue sky and a world so white it seemed scrubbed clean by force. Snow buried the low stone walls, softened the roofs of barns, rounded the shoulders of parked trucks, and made every dark pine stand out with almost painful clarity. From Nolan's cabin, the valley below looked peaceful enough to forgive itself. That was what bothered him. The night had brought a threat to his door. 5 wounded dogs had slept in fear around his woodstove, and somewhere under all that new snow lay tracks, lies, and the beginning of a crime someone had expected winter to swallow. Yet the morning shone as if nothing human could stain it. Nolan left the dogs only after Grace arrived from town with fresh supplies and a face that told him she had slept less than he had. She came into the shop without ceremony, her coat dusted with snow, her old medical bag hanging from one hand, and went first to Briar, then to Cobalt, Juniper, Flint, and Meadow, checking them in the same order Nolan had written on the taped labels. "Go," she said when she saw him hesitate by the stove. "I'll stay until you're back. They don't need more people hovering. They need the same room to keep being the same room." Nolan wanted to argue, but Briar was watching him from her quilt, her torn ear tipped slightly sideways, and Grace was right. If he stayed because he was afraid to leave, he would only be pretending fear was responsibility. So he put on Clara's moss-green cap, took the radio, and followed Sheriff Tessa Holcomb and Caleb Morrow back up toward Brightwater Hill. The road to the old rest station was nearly unrecognizable under the fresh fall. Tessa drove as far as the plowed shoulder would allow, then the 3 of them continued on foot. Tessa moved with her usual contained purpose, dark coat zipped high, notebook tucked inside where the cold could not stiffen the pages. Caleb carried his field kit in one hand and a camera against his chest, his green-gray jacket blending into the spruce shadows whenever he stepped off the trail. Nolan walked behind them at first, not because he was uncertain of the way, but because the slope looked different in daylight. The night before, the trail had been urgency, wind, and cries. Now it was almost beautiful. Sunlight flashed across ice crusts. Snow slid from branches in soft collapses. Somewhere far down the valley, a plow beeped as it backed near the road, the sound oddly ordinary. The closer they came to the rest station, the more Nolan felt the shape of the place returning to him. The bend where Clara had once stopped to catch her breath and laugh at herself for carrying too many blankets, the stump where she had set a thermos, the low clearing where she had stood with town volunteers, proud of a shelter no one thought about until it saved them. The broken lock still lay half-buried near the door. Caleb photographed it before anyone stepped closer. Inside the rest station, daylight did not make the room less cruel. It only made the details harder to deny. The support post stood in a rough square, scarred where straps had rubbed and tightened. The floor showed drag marks beneath a thin dusting of snow blown through the open door. A bench had been shoved against the wall. A broken plastic buckle lay under it, dark blue, almost invisible until Caleb knelt and angled his light. "Nobody panicked while setting this up," he said, not loudly. "See the spacing? They used the posts for load distribution. Kept the animals separated, facing different directions. Whoever did it knew how restraint affects balance. Tessa looked at the straps Nolan had left in a pile near the stove. Could one person manage 5 dogs alone? Caleb considered it. If the dogs were already weakened, drugged, or moved in stages, or if the person had a system. Sled, harness, anchor points. This wasn't rage. Rage is messy. This is procedure. The words settled over the room in a way Nolan disliked. Procedure belonged to rescue manuals, military drills, hospital checklists. It belonged to people trying to keep others alive. Hearing it attached to this place felt like watching someone use a hymn as a threat. Caleb worked slowly. He measured the height of the strap marks. He took samples from the posts, photographed the floor, bagged the broken buckle, and traced a dark smear along the rear threshold where something oily had brushed the wood. He found 2 short lengths of industrial webbing tucked behind a loose board, each cut cleanly, each with the manufacturer's code abraded almost smooth. Someone tried to remove identifiers, he said, not perfectly, but deliberately. Tessa's eyes narrowed. Dale Rusk wouldn't know to do that. Caleb did not look up. I don't know Dale Rusk. No, Tessa said. That's the problem. Most people here don't either, but they're ready to know enough. Nolan stood by the center post, looking at the marks in the wood. In daylight, he could see how low the dog's paws must have hung, how close to relief and how far from it. A quiet anger built in him again, but this time it had nowhere simple to go. If the person who did this had wanted Dale blamed, then anger was part of the trap. A town could be made useful by its hatred. A mob could erase evidence faster than snow. A branch snapped outside. Tessa's hand went to her sidearm. Nolan turned toward the open doorway. Caleb remained crouched, though his eyes lifted. At the far edge of the clearing, where the trail bent toward the ridge, a man stood with both hands visible and a canvas bag hanging from one wrist. He was thin, not from fitness but from a life that had worn him down unevenly. His old brown-gray work jacket hung loose at the shoulders, and a black knit cap sat low over hair cut without care. Stubble darkened his jaw in patches. His face was narrow and tired, with the hollow look of someone who expected every silence to turn against him. In his bag were a small sack of dog food and 2 folded blankets so worn they looked nearly transparent at the edges. That's far enough, Dale, Tessa called. Her voice carried authority without cruelty. The man stopped at once. Dale Rusk did not raise his voice. I figured you'd come up here today. You figured wrong if you thought walking into an active scene was smart, Tessa said. I didn't touch anything. His pale eyes moved from Tessa to Caleb, then to Nolan. They did not linger on Nolan's face. Shame, Nolan thought, had a posture. Dale wore it in his shoulders. I know nobody believes that before I say it, but I didn't. Tessa told him to set the bag down and step into the clearing. Dale obeyed slowly, as if any quick movement might confirm what people already thought of him. Caleb stood now, watching not like a judge, but like a man adding details to a map. Nolan found himself disliking how easily his own body prepared to distrust Dale. The criminal record, the lonely road, the missing dogs, the planted fiber near his woodpile. It was all too neat. Maybe that was why it had worked on so many people already. What are you doing here? Tessa asked. Dale looked at the rest station door. His mouth tightened. Same thing I've been doing 3 weeks. Looking where folks don't want to look. Why? Because every time a dog goes missing, somebody says my name before they say the dog's. He swallowed. And because I heard one of them crying 2 nights ago, up past the quarry road. By the time I got there, it was gone. You expect us to believe you came out in a storm to help dogs? Tessa asked, not because she sounded convinced he was lying, but because someone had to ask it hard enough to see what survived. Dale's face changed then, not into anger exactly, but into something more exposed. No, he said. I don't expect anybody to believe anything good about me. The answer quieted the clearing. Dale looked down at his boots, at the snow packed around them. I did wrong. I stole from the fuel shed. I ran. I was drunk and stupid and mean enough to think scared people owed me something. That part's true. His hand closed and opened once near his coat seam. And yeah, a police dog took me down. People like that part. Makes a clean story. Bad man hates dog. Bad man comes back. Bad man hurts dogs. He gave a small, humorless laugh. Clean stories are easier to sell. Nolan did not move. The cold seemed to sharpen around them. The dog that took me down, Dale continued, didn't ruin my life. I was doing that fine myself. What nobody talks about is the truck coming down Route 6 that night. I was running blind, snow in my face, deputies yelling. If that dog hadn't hit me when it did, I'd have gone straight across the road. He looked up at Tessa now. I hated that animal for 2 years, sat in a cell hating him. Then one night I realized I hated him because he was the last thing that stopped me before I killed myself by being exactly who I was. His voice roughened, and he looked away again. So no, Sheriff, I don't expect belief. I just brought food because if there was another dog up here, I couldn't stand thinking it would hear me leave. Nolan felt the words settle somewhere he had not expected. He had spent 3 years believing withdrawal was a private kind of grief, a thing that hurt no one but himself. Dale's loneliness was different. It had been assigned to him by other people and then reinforced by every look that said his future had already been decided. A guilty past had become a cage he could carry without walls. Nolan looked at the bag of dog food in the snow. The thin blankets Dale's hands held open where everyone could see them. It was not innocence proven. It was simply a human being standing where a monster was easier to imagine. Caleb broke the silence gently. You said you heard a dog past Quarry Road. Did you see tracks? Dale nodded once, grateful for a question that did not sound like an accusation. Snowmobile, not the little kind. Wide track, heavy, went toward the old Northline storage road. Tessa's expression shifted by the smallest degree. Northline recovery? Yeah. Dale's eyes flicked toward Nolan, then away. Reed Malloran's outfit. Seen their sleds running at night more than once. No logos on some of them, but I know the sound. Everybody up here knows the sound if they listen. Nolan knew Northline, of course. Everyone in Brightwater did. The company towed cars from ditches, hauled supplies during storms, ran private rescue equipment when tourists got stuck on closed roads. Reed Malloran, its owner, had spent the last year appearing at town meetings in clean winter gear and a polished steel watch, speaking with practiced concern about safety, liability, failing volunteer systems, outdated trail shelters, and the need for one professional command structure. Nolan had ignored most of it. He had ignored many things since Clara died. Now standing in the rest station she had fought to protect, he wondered how much silence a town could mistake for neutrality before someone else filled it with profit. Tessa did not let the thought run too far. Dale, do you have proof you saw Northline sleds up here? No camera, no pictures. Dale looked embarrassed by the inadequacy. Just me, which means no. It means a statement, Caleb said. Not proof, not nothing. That distinction seemed to reach Dale more kindly than comfort would have. He nodded. Caleb returned to the webbing pieces and held one sealed evidence bag up toward the light. The equipment used here could belong to half a dozen rescue or hauling operations in the county. But these codes were sanded down. That takes intention. The oil from Nolan's door and the rear threshold here are similar, maybe the same cold-grade blend. We'll need lab work. We'll need purchase records. We'll need to know who had access to this kind of gear and why someone wanted Dale's name within arm's reach. Someone planted that strip by his woodpile, Nolan said. Tessa looked at him. Looks that way. Dale's face tightened, but he did not look surprised. That was the saddest part. Of course they did, he said. A town don't need much help believing the thing it already likes. Tessa let him stand there with the sentence. Then she said, You'll come in and give a formal statement. Dale nodded. Am I under arrest? No, the word seemed to confuse him. No, Tessa said again. But if you run, I'll change my mind fast. For the first time, something almost like life crossed Dale's face. Not hope. Hope would have been too much to ask of the moment. Maybe surprise. Maybe the smallest relief at being treated like a man capable of making a choice. I won't run, he said. Nolan believed him before he had reason to. That unsettled him too. They left the rest station after Caleb marked the last sample, and Tessa sealed the broken lock in an evidence bag. Dale walked ahead, not with them exactly, but not banished from them either. At the trail bend, he paused and looked back toward the shelter. Those dogs, he said without turning fully around. They alive? Nolan answered before Tessa could. Yes. Dale nodded once, sharply, as if the word had hit him in the chest. Good. Then he kept walking. By the time Nolan returned to the cabin, afternoon light had begun to thin across the snow. Grace was still in the shop, sitting on an overturned crate near the stove, with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, gone cold. Cobalt slept heavily. Juniper had stopped trying to bury her face. Flint lifted his head when Nolan entered, then lowered it again without panic. Meadow watched the lantern but did not shake as hard. Briar lay closest to the door, eyes open, her body still weak but no longer folded into itself. Nolan stood just inside the shop and looked at her. He thought of Dale standing outside, the light of the clearing with food no one had asked him to bring. He thought of Briar, beaten and frightened, still placing herself between danger and the others. A dog that had been hurt could still be called dangerous by anyone who only saw the flinch. A man who had done wrong could still be blamed forever by anyone who preferred the old story. Brightwater had a cruelty inside it larger than whoever had used those straps. It had a hunger for the easiest villain. Briar's eyes followed him as he crossed the room. Nolan knelt beside her quilt, not touching, just near enough to be seen. "We're going to look harder," he said quietly. "That's the least we can do." Outside, the snow reflected the last of the daylight with a brightness that almost hurt. Under it, tracks were hidden. Under it, lies looked clean. But for the first time since the night he heard the cries on the hill, Nolan understood that finding the person who hurt the dogs would not be enough. They would also have to keep Brightwater from becoming the kind of place where the wrong man could be sacrificed, simply because everyone already knew how to hate him. Grace found the old logo while changing the dressing beneath Briar's neck. The morning had settled into a gray, windless cold, the kind that came after a storm has spent its anger and left the world quiet enough for small sounds to matter. In Nolan's woodshop, the stove had burned low but steady, and the 5 German shepherds rested in the half-circle he had built around warmth. Cobalt slept with the heavy patience of age, his breath still rough but stronger than the day before. Juniper had stopped hiding her face completely, and now watched Grace's hands with wary attention. Flint twitched whenever a tool clicked against the metal tray, but no longer tried to fold himself into the floor. Meadow, whose trembling had once seemed endless, had taken a few careful laps of water from a bowl Nolan held without moving. Briar lay closest to the stove and the door, both unwilling to give up either duty. She did not fight Grace's hands anymore, though she watched every movement as if trust were a language she remembered but had not yet decided to speak. Grace worked slowly, speaking before each touch, cutting away the torn orange strip still tangled near Briar's collar line. "I want to see whether this rubbed through the skin," she said. Nolan stood nearby with a clean towel, feeling useless and necessary at the same time. The strip came loose at last, stiff with dried mud and old ice. Grace turned it toward the light. For a moment she said nothing. Then her thumb brushed over the faded stitching, and her face changed in a way Nolan had not seen before. Not shock exactly, but recognition rising through grief. "Nolan," she said quietly, "look at this." He leaned closer. The fabric was too damaged to read at first, orange worn, almost brown in places, the edge chewed by weather and strain. But beneath a smear of dirt, stitched in dark thread, part of a circular mark remained, a pine tree, a ridgeline, and 3 faded words curved around it. Brightwater searched dogs. Nolan felt the room draw back from him. He had not heard the name spoken in years, not in a way that required him to answer. Brightwater search dogs had once been one of Clara's causes, though she would have hated the word cause. To her it had been simple common sense. In a mountain town, storms did not ask whether a person was rich, careful, stubborn, local, tourist, wise, foolish, or tired. When someone went missing, you searched. If dogs could help, you trained dogs. If volunteers could help, you fed them. If a rest station could keep a man alive until morning, you stocked it before the snow came. Nolan had stood beside her at fundraisers, loading donated blankets into trucks, repairing cracked shelves, pretending to complain when she volunteered him for another Saturday. He had believed he was helping Clara. He had not understood, not fully, that Clara had been helping him belong to something. "Where did she get that?" he asked, though the answer was lying in Grace's hand. Grace turned the strip over, careful not to pull the weak threads apart. Briar may have been part of the old team, or connected to the new one. The stitching is old, but the backing was repaired recently. See here? Newer thread, different color. Nolan sat down on the stool because standing had become too complicated. Briar watched him, her amber eyes, heavy but alert. The gold mark on her chest rose and fell beneath the blanket. He remembered Clara in the church basement, laughing with her sleeves rolled up, tying orange bandanas around the necks of dogs patient enough to endure human ceremonies. He remembered a black and tan shepherd standing beside her once. Maybe not Briar, maybe another dog entirely. But memory did not care about accuracy when it wanted to hurt. He had avoided the church basement after Clara died, avoided town meetings, fundraisers, safety drills, winter planning boards, the rest station, anyone who might say her name in public. He told himself grief had made him private. Now, looking at that torn orange strip, he saw another version of the truth. He had withdrawn from everything Clara had loved because those things kept living without her, and he could not forgive them for it. Grace did not fill the silence. She folded the strip into a clean towel and set it on the workbench. Tessa should see this, she said. By noon, Sheriff Tessa Holcomb and Caleb Morrow had turned the back room of the town office into a temporary evidence space. Nolan went reluctantly, leaving Grace in the shop with the dogs again, though Briar lifted her head when he reached the door and held his gaze long enough to make leaving feel like a promise instead of an escape. The town office smelled of old paper, wet coats, burnt coffee, and the metallic heat of overworked radiators. Caleb had spread photographs, evidence envelopes, and printed records across a table. Tessa stood with her sleeves pushed up, one hand on her hip, reading through a folder marked Winter Response Volunteer Program. A town clerk had unlocked the archive cabinets for them and then retreated, perhaps wisely. Once she understood the past was about to become evidence. Caleb looked up when Nolan entered. The logo matches, he said. Brightwater search dogs shut down officially 6 years ago after funding dried up and liability concerns made the town nervous. But there was a proposal this year to restart it under a smaller winter search program. Tessa slid a paper toward Nolan. Grant application. Approved conditionally last month. Nolan stared at the document without immediately reading it. The name at the top blurred before the words did. Brightwater Winter Search Renewal. Volunteer Canine Evaluation. Rest Station Support. Adult Missing Person Response. Adult? Nolan asked, catching the word because it mattered. Tessa nodded. Hikers, drivers, hunters, residents cut off in storms. No minors in the program files we've found. Mostly winter recovery and live-fine support for adults. Caleb tapped another page. The 5 dogs weren't all full search dogs. That makes this more believable, not less. Briar appears to have prior live-find experience. Cobalt was a retired working dog being evaluated as a stable training presence. Juniper and Meadow came through a rehabilitation network for working breeds. Flint was young, high drive, not fully trained, but promising. They were brought into Brightwater to be assessed, rehabbed, and possibly placed into the renewed program. Who knew they were coming? Nolan asked. Tessa's expression hardened. Town Safety Committee, vet clinic, the transport coordinator, and anyone with access to the public meeting minutes once the grant was discussed. Caleb opened another folder, this one thinner but sharper in its implications. Northline Recovery filed an objection 2 weeks after the grant notice. Reed Malloran argued that volunteer search teams, public shelters, and canine units created confusion during storms. He recommended the town consolidate winter response under a professional contractor. His contractor, Nolan said. Northline, Tessa answered. Nolan had known Reed Malloran mostly from a distance. Clean black rescue jacket, controlled smile, steel watch, voice polished enough to make self-interest sound like responsibility. Reed had spoken at meetings Nolan had not attended. He had written letters Nolan had not read. He had become louder in the public life Nolan had abandoned. Caleb spread out financial filings and county notices, not dramatic in appearance, but damning in the quiet way numbers could be. Northline had loans coming due. 2 private contracts had not renewed. 1 lawsuit had been settled under confidentiality after a delayed response during a storm. He needs the Brightwater contract, Caleb said. Exclusive control of winter towing, rescue transport, emergency road access, and rest station management. If the volunteer program restarts, especially with dogs in public shelters, his argument weakens. Tessa added, And if dogs keep vanishing, if people believe the woods are full of dangerous animals, or that the old volunteer network is being targeted by some unstable ex-con, then Reed gets to say the system is broken and offer the fix. Nolan looked down at the old grant proposal, then at the photographs of Breyer's torn vest strip. Anger came, but it did not arrive alone. Shame walked with it. Clara had spent years building connections that could keep people alive in storms, and Nolan had let men like Reed speak into the space she left because he could not bear to sit in a room where her absence had a chair. He had thought grief was a locked door inside him. Now he saw it had windows. Other things had climbed through. The truth about Reed did not come from one perfect confession or one shining clue. It came from accumulation. A scratched-out equipment code, a planted fiber near Dale's woodpile, objections to the dog program, Northline's financial pressure, old resentment buried under professional language. Years earlier, Caleb found in a county report, Brightwater search dogs had located a missing logger after Northline called off a private search too early. The man survived. Northline lost credibility and later lost a seasonal contract. Reed had never been formally charged with misconduct, but the report noted delayed response, poor route assessment, and uncoordinated command decisions. Tessa read the phrase aloud with disgust. That's a polite way to say he left a man out there. Nolan heard Clara's voice as if she were beside him. They die because everyone assumes someone else will check. In that moment, Reed's motive became clearer and uglier. It was not only money, it was insult. The dogs had once done what Reed had failed to do. They had brought a living man back from the snow after Reed's system missed him, and now, years later, as Brightwater tried to bring those dogs back, something began taking them. That evening, Nolan returned to the woodshop carrying a cardboard box Tessa had found in the town archive. She had not asked if he wanted it. She had simply put it in his truck and said, "These belong to the program. Some of them belong to Clara." He did not open it until Grace left and the dogs had settled into the softer sounds of sleep. Inside were trail maps, old volunteer badges, a stack of Polaroids, a donation ledger in Clara's handwriting, and a red wool scarf he recognized before he touched it. Clara had worn it at winter drives, wrapped twice around her neck, always too bright against snow. Nolan lifted it from the box slowly, as if cloth could bruise. The smell of her was long gone, replaced by paper, dust, and cedar, but memory supplied what time had taken. He sat on the floor near the stove with the scarf in his hands, and for the first time since her funeral, he did not try to stop the wave when it came. He bent forward, the scarf pressed between his palms, and wept without sound because some grief was too old to perform and too deep to deny. Breyer stirred. Nolan wiped his face quickly, embarrassed even alone, but the dog did not retreat from his pain. She lifted herself with effort, crossed the small distance one careful step at a time, and lowered her nose to the scarf. She smelled it for a long while. Not excitedly, not as if finding some magical connection. Simply with the grave attention dogs give to things humans cannot explain. Then she lay down beside it, close enough that one edge of the red wool touched her chest. Nolan stopped breathing for a second. Maybe Breyer had met Clara years ago. Maybe she had stood in some church basement while Clara tied orange cloth around another dog's neck. Maybe the scarf carried nothing except warmth and salt and the faint trace of a life Nolan had loved. It did not matter. A wounded dog had chosen to rest beside the last color Clara had carried into winter, and that was enough to break him open in a cleaner way. Later, when the stove settled and the wind moved gently around the shop, Breyer shifted again and laid her head against Nolan's knee. It was a small weight, no miracle, no cure, just trust beginning before either of them was ready to call it that. Nolan placed his hand on the floor beside her, not on her head, and waited. After a while, Breyer exhaled and her body loosened by a fraction. Nolan looked at the 5 dogs, at the taped names on the blankets, at Clara's scarf bright against the dim woodshop floor. He understood then that protecting them could not mean only keeping them alive through another night. It meant protecting what someone had tried to erase by hurting them. It meant defending the stubborn belief that a town could still search for its people instead of selling fear back to them as safety. It meant opening a door he had kept closed because grief had convinced him that staying apart hurt less. If Clara had been there, she would not have asked whether Briar had earned saving, whether Dale had earned fairness, whether Brightwater had earned another chance. She would have opened the door first and sorted out the rest with cold hands and a hot pot of coffee. Nolan reached for the radio on the bench and pressed the call button. "Tessa," he said when the line crackled alive. "Whatever Reed thinks those dogs represent, he's right to be afraid of it." A pause. Then Tessa's voice, "What are you saying, Nolan?" He looked down as Briar's head remained against his knee. "I'm saying I'm done staying out of Clara's work just because it hurts to remember why it mattered." The shop was quiet after that, but not empty. For the first time in 3 years, Nolan felt the difference. By the next morning, the question was no longer whether Reed Malloran might be involved. The question was how to prove it without becoming exactly the kind of frightened town he had been counting on. Suspicion was easy. Brightwater had already proved that with Dale Rusk. Evidence was harder. Evidence required patience, restraint, and the discipline to let a guilty man walk close enough to his own mistake. Sheriff Tessa Holcomb gathered them in the back room of the town office before noon. Nolan Ashford, hollow-eyed from another short night beside the woodshop stove, Dr. Grace Bellamy, smelling faintly of antiseptic and wet wool, her medical bag still by her feet because she did not trust the dogs out of her reach for long. Caleb Morrow, quiet behind a spread of maps, evidence photos, and equipment lists. Dale Rusk, sitting near the door as if he still expected someone to tell him the chair was not for him. And June Armitage, who arrived late only because she had been clearing a drift off Quarry Road with her old yellow snowplow. June was 61, broad through the shoulders, silver hair cut short under a wine-red knit cap, with the blunt practicality of a woman who had spent 30 winters moving snow that did not care about anyone's feelings. She shook ice from her gloves, looked at the maps, and said, "If Malloran runs, he won't take the main road. He'll cut for the creek shelf and hope the ice holds." Caleb marked the route with a pencil. "Can you block the South Service Trail?" "With the plow, yes. With subtlety, no." Tessa almost smiled. "We don't need subtle once he moves. We need quiet before that." The plan took shape slowly because everyone in the room understood the cost of rushing. They could not arrest Reed on Dale's word, a damaged strap, a financial motive, and a pattern that made sense only when viewed from above. Caleb needed Reed on camera, entering the rest station, touching what he should not know was there, attempting to retrieve or destroy identifiable material, or saying enough to connect himself to Northline's equipment and the attacks. Tessa would control the rumor. A carefully placed comment through the town clerk's office would suggest the 5 dogs were being moved out of Brightwater after dark because Nolan's property was no longer secure. The important lie was not that the dogs would be defenseless. It was that someone desperate might believe the last loose ends were about to leave town. In truth, Cobalt, Juniper, Flint, and Meadow would be taken back to Grace's clinic before sunset and kept in the heated recovery room, with a camera on the rear entrance, Tessa's deputy nearby, and Grace's assistant from the next town sleeping on a cot beside the medicine fridge. Briar was the only one Grace considered stable enough to travel briefly, and even that decision turned the room quiet. "No," Nolan said before Grace had finished explaining. Grace met his eyes. "I am not suggesting we use her. Then she stays with the others. Listen to me." Grace's voice did not rise, but it cut cleanly through his fear. "Briar will not enter the rest station. She will not be tied, exposed, commanded, or placed where Reed can touch her. She will stay in my heated vehicle at the lower line with me. If her stress rises beyond what I think is safe, I drive her out immediately. Her presence is not evidence. The cameras are evidence. Reed's hands are evidence. His choices are evidence." Nolan looked down at the map because looking at Grace felt too much like being seen. Then why bring her at all? Grace hesitated, and that hesitation made her answer more honest. "Because you may need to remember what this is for before Reed tries to make it about your pride." The words landed harder than Nolan wanted to admit. Across the room, Dale looked at his own hands. June unscrewed the cap of her steel coffee thermos and poured into the lid without asking permission. "Dog stays safe," she said. "Man keeps his head. Sounds like a plan if the man can manage it." Nolan looked at her. June took a drink. "Don't look offended." I've pulled enough men out of snowbanks to know pride makes terrible steering. That was the first moment the room felt like a team, instead of a collection of damaged people orbiting the same crime. Dale, who had said almost nothing, leaned forward then. Put me near the creek shelf. Tessa turned. No, he'll think nobody wants to stand there. It's cold, bad footing, and if he knows anything about me, he'll figure I'm too scared to be anywhere alone. That's exactly why I'm saying no. Dale's jaw tightened, but he did not harden into anger. Sheriff, all my life when things got bad, I ran. That's the part of me folks remember because it's true. If Malloran runs that way tonight and I'm not there, then I'm still letting another man decide who I am. Nolan watched him, and in Dale's hunched shoulders he saw a courage that looked nothing like speeches or clean uniforms. It looked like a man asking to stand in the cold where everyone expected him to disappear. Tessa studied Dale for a long time. You stand where Caleb tells you. You do not approach him. You do not try to be a hero. You hold the light. You block the path if it is safe, and you move if I tell you to move. Dale nodded once. That's more trust than I came in expecting. Don't waste it, Tessa said. The controlled rumor moved through Brightwater by late afternoon with the strange speed of small towns and bad weather. By dusk, Nolan had driven the 4 weaker dogs to Grace's clinic, helped settle them in the recovery room, and watched Cobalt lower his head with a tired sigh, as if the room had begun to understand him. Juniper pressed herself against Meadow. Flint stared at the doorway but did not panic when Grace's assistant, a quiet woman named Lila from the county animal hospital, sat near the wall with a book and no intention of bothering him. Briar remained in Nolan's truck longer than the others, wrapped in a thick blanket with Clara's red scarf folded beside her. She was stronger now, but strength in an injured animal was not the same as readiness. When Nolan opened the rear door, she looked toward the clinic, then toward him, then toward the darkening road, as if weighing a world that had not yet earned her confidence. Nolan crouched outside the truck, keeping his hands low. You're not going back into that room, he told her. Not tonight, not ever, because I ask it. Briar blinked slowly. Grace, standing beside him, said nothing. At the lower staging point near the old service road, Caleb placed 2 small cameras in the rest station hours before Reed could arrive, one hidden above a cracked beam and another tucked inside the old supply cabinet, angled toward the rear corner where the damaged webbing had been deliberately left in a metal box labeled with Nolan's handwriting. The box contained nothing irreplaceable. A length of strap with a partially visible code, photocopied pages from the grant file, and a broken buckle Caleb had already documented, enough to alarm a guilty man, not enough to endanger the case if stolen. Tessa positioned herself and 1 deputy beyond the north tree line. June rolled her plow into place down the south service trail, engine off, a hulking yellow shadow behind snow-heavy spruce. Dale took the creek shelf with a flashlight, a radio, and an old reflective coat June had shoved at him because, in her words, if you're going to freeze for justice, at least be visible doing it. Nolan walked alone into the rest station just after moonrise. Snow fell lightly, almost beautifully, and the clearing glowed blue under the moon. He carried the fake file bag and a few pieces of old rescue gear, moving as if he believed himself unseen. Inside, the rest station smelled different now, cold, empty, stripped of the living fear that had filled it days before, but not cleansed. Some rooms remembered. Nolan set the bag near the stove, touched the center post once, and felt anger rise again when his fingers found the worn grooves left by straps. He forced his hand away. This was not the night to feed anger. This was the night to let a man reveal himself. He stepped into the shadow behind the side wall and waited. Waiting had its own violence. The mind-filled silence with every possible failure. Reed not coming, Reed coming armed, Briar panicking in Grace's vehicle, Dale slipping near the creek, Tessa losing sight in the trees, Nolan hearing Clara's name and becoming the wrong version of himself. The radio in his earpiece clicked twice, Caleb's signal from the camera feed. Movement. Then, from beyond the clearing, came the low approach of a snowmobile engine with its lights cut. It stopped behind the ridge. No one entered for another full minute. Reed Malloran was not careless. When he finally appeared at the rear of the rest station, he wore black winter rescue gear without the Northline logo, a dark helmet under one arm, and expensive gloves that looked too clean for a man pretending to be no one. He carried a small fuel can and a tool bag. Even in secrecy, he moved with the tidy confidence of someone used to giving instructions and being believed. He did not look around wildly. He listened. He checked the doorframe. He stepped inside. Caleb's hidden camera gave a faint red blink no human eye would catch. Reed went directly to the metal box. Nolan felt the air change in his lungs. The man did not search the room like a stranger. He crossed to the corner like someone retrieving an object from a place he already knew mattered. Reed opened the lid, saw the strap, and swore under his breath. He took out a knife, began scraping at the remaining code, then paused over the photocopied grant pages. Still trying to crawl back, he muttered, "Stupid old dogs, stupid old town." Nolan stepped out of the shadow. "You always talk to evidence before burning it." Reed's hand stopped, but the rest of him did not startle much. He turned slowly, and when he saw Nolan, his face arranged itself into something close to amusement. He was 55, square-faced, pale-eyed, his gray-blonde hair combed back even under a helmet, his expression polished by years of town meetings and controlled outrage. "Ashford," he said, "you look terrible, playing rescuer keeping you up. You came a long way to check an empty shelter." Reed glanced at the box, then back at Nolan. "And you came a long way to play detective in your dead wife's pet project." The words struck exactly where Reed meant them to. Nolan felt the old red flash rise, fast, blinding, simple. Reed saw it and smiled wider. "That's what this is, isn't it? Clara's little blankets, Clara's little dogs." Clara's belief that kindness could organize a storm. People like her weaken towns. They make everyone think good intentions are a substitute for command. Nolan took one step forward before he knew he had moved. In the earpiece, Tessa's voice snapped softly, "Nolan." From somewhere down the service road, faint through distance and glass, Briar gave a low, strained whine from Grace's heated vehicle. Not loud, not dramatic, just a living sound. Small and pained and present, Nolan stopped. He saw the woodshop floor, the red scarf, Briar's head against his knee, Dale standing in the clearing with hands open. Reed wanted rage. Rage would make the cameras less important, the case muddier, Nolan easier to dismiss. Nolan breathed once, then again. Clara did more for this town with blankets and coffee than you ever did with contracts. Reed's eyes hardened. There, finally, the polish cracked. Your wife ran a charity hobby. I ran response operations. You left a logger on Hoyt Ridge. Reed's jaw flexed. Northline followed the information provided at the time. The dogs found him. A lucky track. Alive. Reed shoved the strap into his bag. Alive men still sue. Alive men still talk. Alive men still ruin reputations because volunteers with dogs get to look noble after professionals make the hard calls. He stopped as if realizing too late how much had slipped out. Nolan did not smile. He did not need to. The room had heard. The cameras had heard. Tessa had heard. Reed's gaze flicked to the beam above the stove, then the cabinet, then Nolan's empty hands. The calculation crossed his face so plainly that Nolan could almost see the path forming in his mind. Fuel can. Fire, confusion, woods, creek shelf. Reed kicked over the fuel can, but before he could strike a flame, Nolan moved, not toward Reed's body, but toward the can, booting it away from the stove. Fuel spilled across the floorboards in a sharp chemical splash. Reed bolted through the rear door into the moonlit snow. "Move," Tessa said over the radio, and the woods came alive without shouting. Reed ran well for a man in heavy gear, cutting behind the station, down the slope toward the creek shelf, exactly as June had predicted. Nolan followed far enough to keep him in sight, lungs burning in the cold, but did not fire, did not tackle, did not give Reed the chaos he wanted. Tessa's deputy closed from the north. June's plow engine roared to life on the south trail, headlights flooding the trees. Reed veered toward the creek where the snow crust thinned over black water. Dale stood there, reflective coat glowing in the plow light, flashlight gripped in both hands. He was shaking, but he did not move away. "Stop," Dale called, voice cracking but clear. "Ice won't hold you." Reed kept coming. "Get out of my way, Rusk." Dale raised the light higher. No. It was a small word. It changed the whole night. Reed tried to cut around him, slipped on the glazed edge, and went down hard. The ice shelf cracked beneath his weight, one leg plunging through into the creek. He grabbed at the snow, suddenly stripped of polish, command, and contempt. For a second, nobody moved. Nolan reached him first. The water was black and fast beneath the broken ice. Reed looked up, eyes wide now, not with strategy but animal fear. Nolan saw the choice laid out with terrible clarity. He could let the cold teach Reed what it had taught the dogs. He could let winter take a man who had used winter as a weapon. The thought came, he would not lie to himself about that later. Then Briar's whine echoed in his memory, and Clara's old sentence rose behind it, warmth before trust. Nolan dropped to one knee and grabbed Reed by the back of his coat. "Help me," he snapped. Dale moved instantly. Together, the veteran and the man accused hauled Reed out far enough for Tessa to seize his arms and cuff him in the snow. Reed coughed, cursed, and tried to recover his face before anyone could see how badly fear had broken it. Tessa read the arrest cleanly, voice steady over the creek. Caleb was already calling for medical transport and securing the tool bag. June stood above them in the plow light, arms folded, and said to Dale, "Told you that coat was useful." Dale let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. As Tessa pulled Reed upright, he turned his pale eyes toward Nolan. Wet, shivering, handcuffed, he still found one last place to aim cruelty. "You saved them tonight, Ashford," he said. "Congratulations. But you can't save everything left out there. Sooner or later, the cold gets what people forget." Nolan did not answer. The words entered him and found the place grief had once hollowed out. This time they did not become fear. They became a question. Behind him, the rest station stood in the moonlit snow, scarred but still standing. Down the road, Briar was alive in Grace's warm vehicle. Dale Rusk was still on his feet. Reed Malloran was finally in cuffs. Nolan watched Tessa lead him away and understood that the night had ended the trap, but not the work. Reed Malloran's arrest did not make Brightwater Notch good again by morning. It did not melt the snow from the road, did not erase the strap marks from the posts inside the rest station, did not teach frightened people how to take back words they had spoken too easily. By sunrise, the town had already begun dividing itself into versions of the story. Some people said they had never trusted Reed. Some said they had always known Northline Recovery cared more about contracts than people. Some lowered their voices when Dale Rusk passed and pretended they had not been the same ones naming him before evidence had a chance to breathe. Sheriff Tessa Holcomb did not let the town rewrite itself too cleanly. She held a short statement outside the town office in a dark winter coat with snow melting on the shoulders and said plainly that Reed Malloran had been arrested after attempting to remove and destroy evidence connected to the abuse and disappearance of multiple working dogs. She said the investigation would include Northline equipment logs, financial records, vehicle use, purchase orders, and prior complaints. Then, without softening her voice for anyone's comfort, she added that Dale Rusk had assisted law enforcement during the arrest and was not a suspect in the attacks. No speech could wash away weeks of suspicion, but the sentence landed where people had to hear it. Dale stood across the street near the hardware store, hands in the pockets of his old coat, black knit cap pulled low, shoulders set as if waiting for the statement to turn against him at the last second. When it did not, he did not smile. He only looked down at the snow and breathed out slowly, as if being spared another accusation was too unfamiliar to trust all at once. The legal work moved with none of the drama people expected from justice. Caleb Morrow spent days sealing evidence, comparing fibers, requesting lab results on the cold weather oil, matching the partially sanded equipment codes to Northline inventory, and building a timeline from snowmobile fuel purchases, storage access, and the hidden camera footage from the rest station. Tessa took statements from Nolan, Grace, Dale, June, the town clerk, and half a dozen adults who had reported missing dogs but never connected their losses because grief had come to each of them separately. Grace Bellamy kept the clinic doors locked after hours and the rear recovery room warm. Cobalt slept through most of the first week, waking only for water, medicine, and the quiet pressure of Grace's hand near his shoulder. Juniper learned first to lift her eyes, then to leave her nose uncovered. Flint's fear of metal remained sharp, but when June began visiting with a pocket full of soft treats and the distant rumble of her snowplow idling outside, He stopped trembling at every mechanical sound and started tilting his head instead, confused by the possibility that a machine could arrive without pain following it. Meadow recovered in smaller ways, one full breath without shaking, one step toward a bowl, one nap where her paws did not twitch. Briar stayed at Nolan's woodshop. Grace did not call it adoption. Nolan did not either. At first it was simply medical practicality. Briar panicked less there. She rested more deeply when she could see Nolan moving around the stove. She still flinched if the latch clicked too hard, still stiffened when wind struck the wall, still watched every door as if safety might forget itself. But each morning she chose a place a little closer to the threshold. Not outside, not yet, just closer. Nolan began to understand that healing was not the opposite of fear. Sometimes healing was fear learning it no longer had to be in charge of every step. Nolan did not become a different man in a week. The house still held Clara in ways that ambushed him. Her white mug remained on the second shelf, turned handle out the way she had liked it. Her gardening gloves still sat in a tin near the back door, though the beds outside were buried under snow. The chair beside the stove was still empty, and there were mornings when Nolan woke from a dream of her voice and reached the kitchen before remembering that no one had called his name. The difference was that the remembering no longer ended the day before it began. There was water to warm for Briar, medicine to measure, a stove to feed, a radio schedule with Grace, tracks to shovel so Tessa could reach the shop if needed. Once, Grace left a folder on Nolan's kitchen table beneath a jar of dog biscuits she claimed were for training, not sentiment. Inside were Briar's medical notes, vaccination updates, a recovery plan, and a transfer form with Nolan's name typed carefully in the blank marked primary caretaker. He stood over it for a long time. Briar lay near the mudroom door, her torn ear tipped toward him. "This your idea?" he asked her. Briar blinked, then lowered her head onto Clara's red scarf, which had become hers by a kind of quiet treaty neither Nolan nor Grace had formally approved. Nolan signed the form with Clara's old pen. The ink caught once in the paper, leaving a slight break in his last name. He stared at that broken line and felt, strangely, not sorrow but permission. Some things could continue imperfectly and still be true. Brightwater's decision about the old winter route came after a town meeting that lasted 3 hours, and felt like a reckoning trying to wear the clothes of procedure. Northline's proposal was withdrawn pending investigation. The exclusive contract died without ceremony. A new committee formed to rebuild the public rest station and revive a smaller, stricter Brightwater search dogs program under county oversight, veterinary supervision, and volunteer training standards that left no room for nostalgia pretending to be competence. Nobody said Clara's name at first. Then June Armitage did, because June had never had much patience for rooms afraid of the obvious. Clara Ashford kept that shelter stocked when half of us thought a weather report counted as a plan, she said from the back row, her wine-red cap in her hands. If we're fixing it, we ought to fix it in the spirit of the person who remembered we were supposed to check on each other. No one argued. Nolan sat near the side wall, not hidden, not central. Briar at his feet on a loose lead Grace had approved only because the room was calm and every adult there had been warned not to crowd her. When June finished speaking, Briar leaned her shoulder lightly against Nolan's boot. He looked down, and for once the mention of Clara did not feel like a hand closing around his throat. It felt like a door being opened by someone who knew he was not ready, but believed he could still step through. The repairs began the next Saturday under a sky so bright the snow hurt to look at. They did not turn the rest station into a monument. That would have been easier and less useful. They fixed the walls, replaced warped boards, installed a safer stove, stocked water, canned food, dry socks, trail maps, a hand-crank radio, battery lanterns, a first aid kit, dog blankets, spare leashes, and a sealed bin marked for search team's emergency use. Caleb helped install a lockbox with county access codes. Tessa posted clear rules. Grace inspected the corner meant for injured animals and made Nolan move the blankets away from drafts twice. June cleared the approach road with her plow and cursed every root that had shifted under the snow. Dale came before most people arrived and shoveled the steps without being asked. For the first hour, people nodded at him but did not know where to put their guilt. Apologies, Nolan noticed, were harder for some than accusations had been. Then June walked over carrying 2 steel cups from her thermos. She handed one to Dale. "Coffee," she said. Dale took it with both hands, head lowered. No one clapped, no one made it a scene, but after that, when a stack of boards needed moving, one of the men from the feed store asked Dale to take the other end. Small things, Nolan thought, could either keep a man outside or let him cross the threshold. That morning, Brightwater managed one small thing. The dogs found their next places slowly, with Grace watching every match as fiercely as she watched Stitches. Cobalt went to an older couple who had once handled search dogs before age made the long winter calls too dangerous. He would not work again, but he would be understood. Juniper stayed with Grace, officially as a foster, unofficially because Grace had begun talking to her during inventory, and Juniper had started falling asleep to the sound of her voice. Flint surprised everyone by choosing June's plow yard, where controlled exposure to the low engine rumble turned fear into curiosity, then curiosity into a strange loyalty to the woman who smelled of diesel, coffee, and wool. Meadow joined the renewed program only in the gentlest way, walking short scent games near the clinic, never pushed, never made a symbol before she was allowed to be a dog. Briar remained Nolan's. She wore a soft chestnut leather collar now, with a small brass tag Grace had ordered without asking. It said Briar on one side and an N. Asford on the other. The first time Nolan read it, he rubbed his thumb over the letters until the brass warmed beneath his hand. The reopening of the rest station happened on a morning of clean blue light, after several days of thaw and refreeze had hardened the snow into glittering crust. Adults gathered in work coats and wool hats. A retired nurse, 2 loggers, a mechanic from the lake road, June with her plow idling at the edge of the clearing, Tessa with a clipboard, Grace with medical supplies, Caleb checking the radio, Dale standing near the steps with a shovel, though the steps were already clear. No children, no ceremony too polished to be believed, no ribbon that would look foolish against the scars still visible on the support posts. Nolan had built a new table for the center of the room from pine boards sanded smooth but left plain. Under the front edge, where only someone kneeling or searching would see it, he had carved Clara in small letters, not a plaque, not a dedication speech, just her name where the work would happen. When Nolan opened the door, Briar stood beside him. The room had been changed, but not enough to lie. The same posts rose from the floor. The same shape of space held the memory of straps. Conversation faded behind them. Nolan felt the leash slacken his hand and then removed the tension entirely, letting it fall in a loose curve. "No hurry," he said quietly. Briar stepped over the threshold, then stopped. Her body went still, her torn ear angled back. One paw lifted and hovered, unable for a breath to choose the floor. Nolan did not pull. He did not coax her with sweetness that might become pressure. He lowered himself slowly to one knee and placed his palm flat on the boards beside him, the way he had done on the first nights in the shop. Near enough to be found, far enough to leave the choice hers. Briar trembled. Her eyes moved to the posts, to the stove, to Nolan's hand, then to the open door behind her where daylight waited if she needed it. One step came, then another. The whole room seemed to hold its breath as she passed beneath the place where straps had once held her between standing and falling. Her legs shook, but she kept moving. At the new stove, she lowered herself onto the folded blanket Grace had placed there and rested her head on her paws. Nolan looked at her and felt tears come before he could decide whether to stop them. He did not. Outside, one of the other dogs barked. Then another answered from the clearing, and the sound rose bright across the snow. For weeks, the voices from Brightwater Hill had reached Nolan as broken cries, pulled thin by wind, carrying pain from a place he had tried not to remember. Now the sound was different, not healed beyond all hurt, not innocent, but alive, joined, returning. Dale stood in the doorway with his coffee cooling in his hands. June pretended not to see Nolan crying. Grace did not pretend. She only smiled a little, tired and proud. Nolan touched the edge of the new table, feeling the hidden letters beneath the wood. Reed had told him he could not save everything left outside. Maybe that was true, maybe no one could. But Brightwater did not have to use that truth as permission to abandon what stood in front of it. Nolan looked at Briar lying by the stove, at the adults gathered in the shelter Clara had once believed in, at Dale no longer standing alone beyond the light, and understood that some promises were not made because a person was certain they could keep them perfectly. They were made because the cold was real, the world was wide, and someone had to open the door anyway. In the snowy hills of Brightwater, a lonely veteran hears distant cries coming from an abandoned rest shelter before a storm closes in. What he finds there changes everything. 5 German shepherds left in fear, a town ready to blame the wrong man, and a hidden truth tied to a forgotten rescue team his late wife once believed in. This emotional veteran and dog story is about loss, loyalty, second chances, and the quiet courage it takes to open the door again after grief. If Nolan and Briar's journey touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories of hope, healing, and faithful companions.